The first piece is something that is accepted by almost unanimous scholarship, which is that after Jesus died, his disciples said he appeared to them again alive. There is not a lot of doubt among scholars that the disciples believed this had happened. Bart Ehrman says, "I don't doubt at all that some disciples claim this." Paul, writing about 25 years later, indicates that this is what they claimed, and I don't think he is making it up. E.P. Sanders says, "It is an equally secure fact that Jesus' disciples saw him, in what sense is not certain, after his death. Thereafter his followers saw him." The reason for this is because it has multiple attestation in various sources, including Josephus, and there is no way to explain the rise of Christianity if this did not happen. Something had to happen which compelled the disciples to begin the world's largest religion with seemingly nothing. Well, people claim they see all sorts of things, so why should we take the claims of the disciples seriously? How do we know their testimony is reliable and they were not simply making the appearances up? Well, in our previous series, we've already established the New Testament is very early and reliable in what it reports, so there is plenty of evidence their testimony is reliable. But putting that aside, we should at least evaluate when eyewitness testimony is unreliable. For instance, when events happen quickly or over a period of a few seconds, it is hard to retain memory of an event. Or when people go out looking for what they want to find. People that are desperately desiring to find Bigfoot will sometimes fool themselves into thinking they found something. Or when the participants are all strangers, like during a bank robbery. It is hard to retain memory when you are around unfamiliar people. And last, it is hard to retain memory if there was a weapon involved, for the simple reason that everyone is focused on the weapon and not anything else. However, if we examine the resurrection reports, none of these seem to be a factor. There is certainly not a weapon involved, and it is not with strangers. The disciples are familiar with each other, and who they are witnessing they believe had risen. The disciples were also not expecting Jesus to rise from the dead. All the accounts embarrassingly report that the disciples had misunderstood the scriptures and what Jesus had claimed, and they did not expect him to come back. And the reports do not seem to happen quickly, but over a period of time, where Jesus would eat and drink with them and engage in conversations or give them instructions. Even if you could write off the Gospels and Acts as later myths, we still have preserved for us early creeds and oral sermons handed down which report these as well. So the reports on the surface level do not match circumstances that create unreliable testimony. As E.P. Sanders admits, they definitely experienced something, which doesn't bode well for the conspiracy theory. So what if these accounts were just made up at a later date? Well, this seems to be rejected by most scholars, since Paul preserved for us an early creed in 1 Corinthians 15, which is a list of witnesses that Jesus was said to have appeared to. They include Peter, the rest of the disciples, a group of 500 at once, then James, and then all the apostles. Most scholars believe this list of witnesses in the creed goes back to within 3 years of Pentecost. The reasons for this are simply overwhelming. It is formed in a mnemonic structure and with parallelism, and it is less than 50 words. And all this seems to mean it was an early creed for catechizing new Christians. It was something easy to learn and memorize. Paul also says to the Corinthians, "I delivered to you what I received." This is a rabbinic statement for a teacher passing on something to his students, so it would have to have come from the disciples themselves very early on before they could teach it to Paul. The creed also calls Peter Cephas, and not by his name Peter. Cephas was an early name for him. Only later on was he called Peter. And it has an independent tradition that is not contingent on the Gospels, such as the appearance to James and the independent appearance to Peter. Gerald O'Collins says that he doesn't know of any New Testament scholar who dates the creed after the mid-40s. So all the evidence suggests it is very early, and this means the reports of appearances are very early on as well, and that rules out the mythic theory. What about the hallucination theory? Well, the problem is the appearances happen in group settings, even in the early creed, and group hallucinations are exceptionally rare, and because of this there is not a lot of scientific literature to explain them. In a private email with scholar Mike Licona, psychologist Dr. Gary Sibsey says, "I have surveyed the professional literature, peer-reviewed journal articles and books, written by psychologists, psychiatrists, and other relevant healthcare professionals during the past 2 decades, and have yet to find a single documented case of a group hallucination, an event for which there is more than one person purportedly sharing in a vision or other sensory perceptions, where there was clearly no referent." So there is not a lot of scientific evidence group hallucinations can happen. Peer-reviewed work on hallucinations also reports that they most often manifest in one sensory mode, such as auditory or visual, and that multimode hallucinations are exceptionally rare. Yet the appearances of Jesus contain at least both of these elements, making the hallucination theory exceptionally improbable. For an hallucination to explain the appearances, you would have to say that the disciples are all each having a rare multimode hallucination, and that they are all agreeing Jesus is doing certain things like eating and drinking and giving them the exact same instructions, and this would need to have happened multiple times, not just once. Even if you could write off the Gospels and Acts as later myths, we still have the early creed preserved in 1 Corinthians 15 and other early sermons preserved in Acts, which report that Jesus ate and drank with the disciples. C.H. Dodd notes the speeches in Acts seem very early because they lack influence from Pauline theology or vocabulary. They contain a high degree of Semitism, meaning they were likely originally Aramaic, and they lack resemblance to the original written elements of Acts and Luke, meaning they likely predate Acts and seem to be very early Aramaic speeches. So the reports are very early, and appear in group settings, multisensory, and over a period of time. And hallucinations with these elements are so improbable it would have to be a miracle to cause one, let alone several. But what about the power of suggestion? Sometimes one person can cause others around them to hallucinate the same thing through the power of suggestion, such as people in a lifeboat, where one thinks they see a ship in the distance, and they all think they see the same ship. In Anomalistic Psychology, a study of extraordinary phenomena of behavior and experience, authors Zusse and Jones write some of the very little literature on group hallucinations, and theorize that if there is an expectation, emotional excitement, and people having been informed beforehand, then a group hallucination may be possible. It is also believed they will vary in what is reported. Zusse and Jones cite an event from 1917 where 70,000 people said they witnessed a public miracle. However, the reports varied. Although the children reportedly saw the Virgin, the crowd, at least many of them, witnessed a color phenomenon in which the sun, in the shape of a fiery disk, began to move and approach the earth. However, Zusse and Jones also had to conclude with, the final answer to these questions has yet to be obtained, so they still maintain a scientific explanation has yet to explain collective hallucinations. However, even if they could, it is interesting how their criteria doesn't fit the resurrection appearances. Expectation and excitement were definitely not present. The narratives embarrassingly portray the disciples as cowardly running for their lives after Jesus was crucified. They even doubted the report of the women, and when they first saw Jesus, they were frightened, which shows they were not excited and didn't understand what was going on. Second, it is interesting that if the appearances of Jesus were hallucinations, then they do not fit the criteria of varying drastically between reports. All report a bodily resurrection of Jesus, where he looks sort of like himself, but also slightly different, and his body has new powers it did not have before. As William Lane Craig says, the fact remains that there is not a single instance in the case books exhibiting the diversity involved in the post-mortem appearances of Jesus. But the biggest problem with the hallucination theory is this. Even if you discount the Gospels as unreliable, one still has to account for the early Christians preaching bodily resurrection and not a spiritual appearance. The first Christians were very familiar with visions and claimed to actually have some. In Acts 12, when the servant girl finds Peter at the gate, she runs to tell everyone, and they tell her the appearance she had was just an angel. So the Christians firmly understood what visions and spiritual experiences were. Yet they never interpreted the appearances of Christ as just spiritual visions. They firmly believe it was a bodily appearance, and that is what they preach from the beginning, as even skeptical scholar Gerd Ludemann agrees. So since the appearances were in group settings, multisensory, do not vary, were never interpreted to be spiritual, but always physical, there was no expectation or excitement for them, the hallucination theory could not account for these appearances. So what about the conspiracy theory? Well, despite the early facts we mentioned about how the resurrection appearances do not match factors that make testimony unreliable, it would be hard to explain how the Christians could hold together such a radical conspiracy with over 500 people involved. Before Christ was crucified, they couldn't even keep Judas from betraying them. However, if all we have to go on is the appearances themselves, and no other piece of data, we have to accept that this theory could at least tentatively account for the reports of appearances, even though it seems like a stretch. So I don't see any reason why the conspiracy theory could not account for this piece of data, if especially there was no more data to go over. Finally, the resurrection theory can account for this, since if Jesus did rise from the dead, reporting his physical appearance makes perfect sense. This brings us to the appearances themselves. As for Paul, who was a skeptic, he accepts Paul had to experience something which would cause his conversion, but he just says Paul had a vision which converted him. But as we have already demonstrated, this is untenable, since Paul would have been the least likely to convert or experience a hallucination of Jesus. So this is ad hoc. With the other appearances, he says some of them were made up, but some were real. So he tries to mix a hallucination and conspiracy theory. I don't know why he thinks the appearance to 500 can simply be dismissed as false. He agrees the creed in 1 Corinthians 15, which mentions this, is very early. He only seems to imply it could not happen because 500 people could not experience Jesus at once, which is arguing from a presupposition. If the only reason as to why it could not happen is because Jesus did not rise from the dead, then it simply is arguing in a circle, and that doesn't actually refute the evidence. Sure, it is possible it was just an invention, but it would have been very hard for the Christian to make this up very early on without actually having the witnesses to back this up, unless they somehow managed to keep 500 people in on it. And again, if some people had visions in this Jewish culture where resurrection was not supposed to happen yet, these visions would only have implied a spiritual vindication to heaven, not a physical return to life. Plus, as we already went over, the appearances do not match typical signs of hallucinations. But we'll allow this one to tentatively pass, since it still is possible they were made up, if this is the only fact we have to go on. Because of this, the assumption the disciples were in a condition to hallucinate a physical resurrection is lacking. Even if Peter was grief-stricken and convinced the others to partake in his hallucination, there would be little reason to think all would hallucinate and experience the same thing, let alone infer a physical resurrection. Group hallucinations are exceptionally rare, and are supposed to vary in what is reported, and we already dealt with the psychology before and demonstrated the appearances do not match the conditions of what would be required for group hallucinations. So the same conditions apply as before. As Dale Allison says, one person can hallucinate, but 12 at the same time, and dozens over an extended period of time? These are legitimate questions, and waving a magic wand of mass hysteria will not make them vanish. So, as we've already explained, hallucinations cannot explain these appearances without lacking plausibility.